I'm Natalie Warner, 32 years old, and last Thanksgiving, my family's dining room became a stage for the cruelest performance I'd ever witnessed. The smell of roasted prime rib filled the air as my mother Patricia carried plates to the table, each one a masterpiece of holiday excess. Thick cuts of perfectly seared beef, golden roasted potatoes glistening with butter, glazed carrots arranged like they belonged in a magazine spread. My siblings Derek and Kevin got heaping portions. My sister Olivia received hers with a tight smile. Even Aunt Rachel and Uncle Gerald were served with ceremony and care. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Then my mother reached my seat. She placed a chipped ceramic plate in front of me, the kind we usually gave to the dog. On it sat a dried-out piece of pot roast from 2 days ago, gray and tough-looking, next to a small mound of plain white rice. No vegetables. No garnish. Nothing. The contrast was so stark it felt like a slap across the face. The table went quiet. Derek smirked into his wine glass. Kevin tried to hide his grin. My father Robert stared at his own plate, refusing to meet my eyes. My mother stood behind my chair, her hand resting on the back like she was about to give a speech. "This is what you've earned, Natalie," she said, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "We serve based on contribution to this family, and well, this reflects yours accurately." The room should have erupted in protest, but instead, Derek raised his glass. "Here's to getting what we deserve," he said, and Kevin clinked his glass against it. Olivia looked down, her fork frozen halfway to her mouth. Aunt Rachel shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. I sat there, my hands in my lap, feeling the weight of their judgment press down on me. They thought this was my rock bottom. They thought I'd cry or storm out or beg for scraps of their respect. Instead, I picked up my fork and took a bite of that awful dried meat, chewing slowly while maintaining eye contact with my mother. The texture was like leather, but I smiled anyway. Then I set down my fork and leaned back in my chair. "Mom," I said, my voice cutting through the awkward silence, "I have a question about the business." She stiffened, her smile faltering for just a second. "What business?" she said sharply. "Warner and Sons is no longer your concern." I nodded slowly, letting the pause stretch. "That's interesting," I said, "because I heard you're selling it." Tom Anderson at First Valley Bank mentioned something about a $15 million deal going through. "How's that working out for you?" The color drained from her face. Derek's glass stopped midway to his lips. My father finally looked up, confusion spreading across his features. "How do you know Tom Anderson?" my mother demanded, her voice rising. I smiled wider. "Oh, we've worked together on several acquisitions over the past few years. He's handled some of my bigger deals. Lovely guy. Very thorough with paperwork." My mother's hand tightened on the back of my chair. "What deals?" she hissed. I stood up, smoothing my napkin and placing it carefully beside that insulting plate of scraps. "The deals I've closed through my company," I said. "Apex Industrial Solutions. We specialize in buying struggling manufacturing businesses and turning them around. Surely you've heard of us. We're based in Portland, but we've been making quite a name for ourselves across the Northwest." Derek shot to his feet. "What are you playing at, Natalie?" he snarled. "I'm not playing at anything," I said calmly. "I'm just curious about who's buying Warner and Sons. You know, Grandfather Frank's company. The one he built with his own hands. The one Mom's been running into the ground for the past 18 years. Patricia slammed her hand on the table, rattling the fine china. "How dare you?" she shouted. Derek jumped in, his face red. "You have no right to talk about the business. You left. You gave up." I let them sputter and rage for a moment before I dropped the bomb. "I didn't give up," I said, my voice steel. "And I didn't leave. You threw me out, remember? Called me a foolish girl with unrealistic ideas. Said I'd never amount to anything in this industry. Well, guess what? I became exactly what you said I couldn't be. And now," I paused, watching their faces, "I own Warner and Sons. The company you just sold? You sold it to me." The room exploded. Kevin knocked over his wine glass, red liquid spreading across the white tablecloth like blood. Olivia gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Aunt Rachel grabbed Uncle Gerald's arm. My father stood up so fast his chair tipped backward and crashed to the floor. Derek's face went from red to purple. "You're lying," he screamed. "This is some sick joke." My mother just stood there, frozen, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. I pulled my phone from my pocket and opened my email, turning the screen toward them. "Here's the signed purchase agreement," I said. Apex Industrial Solutions acquired Warner & Sons Manufacturing for $14.2 million. Closing date was yesterday, November 22nd. I am the sole owner and CEO. Everything you thought you were selling to some anonymous investment firm? That was me. I've been planning this for 6 months. To understand how I got to that moment, you need to know about my grandfather, Frank Warner. Growing up in Riverside, Oregon, I spent every possible moment at Warner & Sons Manufacturing. The factory sat on the eastern edge of town, a sprawling complex of workshops and warehouses where the smell of fresh cut would mix with varnish and machine oil. Grandfather Frank built the place in 1972 with money he'd saved from 2 decades of carpentry work. He didn't just want to make furniture. He wanted to create pieces that would outlive him, that families would pass down through generations. I was 7 the first time he brought me onto the factory floor. He held my small hand in his calloused one and walked me past the massive saws and planers, the assembly stations where craftsmen fitted joints with precision that seemed almost magical. "See that table, Natalie," he said, pointing to a massive conference table being finished in the corner. "That'll be in some company's boardroom for 50 years. Long after I'm gone, people will sit around it making decisions that shape lives. That's not just furniture. That's legacy." He taught me to see beauty in the grain of the wood, to understand why certain joints held stronger than others, to appreciate the difference between rushed work and craftsmanship. By the time I was 10, I could identify different wood species by sight and touch. Oak, maple, cherry, walnut, each had its own character, its own story. Grandfather Frank would quiz me during lunch breaks, holding up samples and grinning when I got them right. "You've got the eye," he'd say, tapping his temple. "Can't teach that. You're born with it." I started working real shifts when I turned 13. Nothing major at first, just sweeping up sawdust and organizing the tool rooms. But Grandfather Frank made sure I rotated through every department. I spent time in the design studio watching drafters turn client ideas into technical drawings. I learned finishing techniques from old Eddie Marsh, who'd been with the company since the beginning and could make wood grain pop like it was alive. I worked the shipping dock with Carlos and Jimmy, understanding how every piece had to be protected and handled with care. Grandfather Frank believed in constant improvement. He'd gather the team every Friday afternoon and ask what could be better. How do we cut waste? How do we improve quality? How do we serve our customers more effectively? I loved those meetings, the way everyone's input mattered, the way a suggestion from a floor worker could reshape an entire process. When I was 15, I noticed we were throwing away tons of wood scraps that could be repurposed for smaller items. I sketched out a plan for a line of desk accessories using the waste material. Grandfather Frank didn't just pat me on the head and dismiss it. He called in the production manager and the design team, and we spent 3 hours working through the logistics. Within 2 months, we had a new product line. Small things, pen holders, picture frames, desk organizers, all crafted from wood that would have been trash. It wasn't a huge moneymaker, but it embodied everything Grandfather Frank believed in. Nothing wasted. Everything made with purpose. Quality in every detail, no matter how small. Those years shaped who I became. Grandfather Frank didn't just teach.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Me about furniture manufacturing. He taught me to see systems, to understand how small changes could cascade into major improvements. He showed me financial statements and explained profit margins, material costs, and labor efficiency. When I was 16, he started taking me to client meetings. "Sit in the corner and listen," he'd say. "Watch how people communicate what they want versus what they actually need. Your job is to bridge that gap." I watched him transform vague requests into concrete plans. A client would say they wanted something modern, and he'd spend an hour asking questions about their space, their workflow, their aesthetic preferences. By the end, he'd have a complete picture and could sketch something that perfectly matched their vision, often in ways they hadn't articulated themselves. That's not salesmanship, he told me afterward. That's listening. Most people in business don't actually listen. They wait for their turn to talk. Big difference. But in 2005, everything changed. Grandfather Frank had a massive heart attack while working in his office. He was 73 and had been talking about slowing down, but could never quite step away from the place he'd built. I was only 15, sitting in geometry class when my father came to pull me out of school. The drive to the hospital was silent except for my own sobbing. By the time we arrived, he was gone. The funeral was enormous. Workers from the factory, clients from across the region, even competitors came to pay respects. They told stories about Frank Warner's integrity, his craftsmanship, his kindness. But as they lowered him into the ground, I felt a knot forming in my stomach. Who would run Warner and Sons now? My father Robert had never been involved in the business. He was a high school English teacher, content with his books and his classroom. That left my mother Patricia. Mom had always been around the business, handling administrative work and bookkeeping. But she'd never been on the factory floor, never really understood what made Warner and Sons special. At the will reading, Grandfather Frank left the company to my father with the understanding that Patricia would manage operations. There was a provision in the will, a handwritten note that said I was to have a role in the company when I turned 18, with the option to buy in as a partner when I turned 25. He believed I had the vision to carry his legacy forward. That note might as well have been kindling for the fire Patricia lit under everything Grandfather Frank built. Within months of taking over, she started making changes. The first thing to go was the Friday afternoon improvement meetings. Waste of productive time, she declared. People need to focus on output, not sitting around talking. Next, she renegotiated contracts with our suppliers, switching from the premium materials Grandfather Frank insisted on to cheaper alternatives. It'll save us 30% on material costs, she announced at a hastily called staff meeting. No one will notice the difference in the final product. But people did notice. Within 6 months, we started getting complaints. Table surfaces that warped. Chair joints that loosened. Finishes that wore through too quickly. Eddie Marsh, our master finisher, tried to explain to Patricia that the cheaper stains didn't penetrate the wood properly, that they'd never hold up to commercial use. She cut him off mid-sentence. The clients are paying the same price and we're making more profit, she said. That's what matters. Eddie quit 2 weeks later after 40 years with the company. I cried when he told me he was leaving. Patricia's focus was singular and brutal. Profit margins became the only metric that mattered. She pushed production speeds higher, demanding workers complete pieces in less time. Quality control became a bottleneck in her eyes, so she reduced inspection time. When the design team proposed new custom options that clients were requesting, she shot them down. Stick to the catalog, she ordered. Custom work takes too long and costs too much. We're not a boutique operation. I watched the soul drain out of Warner and Sons. The craftsmen who'd worked with pride under Grandfather Frank started going through the motions. The innovation stopped. The care that had defined every piece became a memory. I was still in high school, but spent every free moment at the factory, trying to hold on to what Grandfather Frank had built. I'd talk to the workers, listen to their frustrations, and dream about the day when I'd have a real say in how things were run. When I turned 18, I enrolled at Oregon State University studying business management and industrial design. I commuted from Riverside, refusing to live on campus because I wanted to stay connected to Warner and Sons. Patricia had promised me a formal role once I started college, citing Grandfather Frank's wishes in the will. But the role she gave me was insulting. Assistant to the administrative coordinator. Basically, I filed paperwork and answered phones while watching my mother systematically dismantle everything my grandfather had created. I tried to be patient. I told myself I needed to learn the business side, understand the financial realities Patricia kept talking about. But every day brought new frustrations. She'd implemented a policy of accepting the lowest bids on every supply contract, which meant our lumber came from mills that clear-cut forests with no sustainability practices. When I pointed out that clients were increasingly asking about environmental responsibility, she laughed in my face. Tree hugger nonsense, she said. Wood is wood. Nobody cares where it comes from as long as the price is right. Derek had joined the company right out of college 2 years before grandfather Frank died. He'd taken a sales position and quickly become Patricia's favorite. Where I saw problems that needed solving, Derek saw opportunities to squeeze more money out of existing clients. He'd push them to accept cheaper alternatives, convincing them that the quality difference was negligible. His commission checks grew fatter, while customer satisfaction scores plummeted. But Patricia loved him because he brought in revenue, even if it was built on eroding the trust grandfather Frank had spent decades establishing. By my sophomore year, I couldn't stay silent anymore. I started documenting everything I saw going wrong. Customer complaints were at an all-time high. Our return rate had tripled compared to grandfather Frank's era. Worker morale was in the basement, with experienced craftsmen leaving for competitors who still valued quality work. I compiled all this data into a presentation and requested a meeting with Patricia and the board of directors, which consisted of my mother, my father, and 2 longtime business associates of grandfather Frank. The meeting was a disaster from the start. I walked them through the numbers, showing how short-term profit gains were masking long-term damage to the brand. I presented customer feedback, highlighted the loss of key personnel, and demonstrated how our market share was shrinking as competitors offered better quality at comparable prices. Then I laid out a comprehensive plan to reverse course. We needed to return to premium materials, reinvest in our workforce, and modernize our operations with new equipment that could improve both quality and efficiency. Patricia let me finish, her face growing darker with each slide. Then she stood up and pointed at the door. "This meeting is over," she said. Derek smirked from his seat in the corner. One of the board members, an old friend of grandfather Frank named Walter Grayson, tried to interject. "Susan makes some valid points, Patricia," he said carefully. "Maybe we should consider her proposals." My mother wheeled on him. "She's a 20-year-old college student who's worked here for 3 years," she snapped. "I've been running this company successfully while she was playing with dolls. We're profitable. That's what matters." I gathered my materials with shaking hands. The other board member, Patricia's cousin Leonard, hadn't said a word the entire time. My father sat there examining his fingernails, refusing to engage. As I reached the door, Walter caught up with me in the hallway. "Your grandfather would be proud of that presentation," he said quietly. "Don't give up." But I could see the defeat in his eyes. He knew as well as I did that Patricia controlled the votes and the company. That rejection lit something inside me. If they wouldn't listen to data and reason, I'd have to prove myself in ways they couldn't ignore. I started staying late at the factory, working with the night shift crew who were more willing to experiment. We tested new finishing techniques that could cut application time while improving durability. I redesigned the layout of the assembly floor to reduce movement and wasted motion, implementing ideas from lean manufacturing principles I was learning in school. The night supervisor, a gruff veteran named Tom Chin, gave me free rein as long as I didn't disrupt production quotas. Within 3 months, our night shift was outperforming the day shifts in both speed and quality. Defect rates dropped. Production time per unit decreased. Worker satisfaction on the night crew improved measurably. I documented everything meticulously, building another presentation. This time I had proof of concept, real-world results that couldn't be dismissed as theoretical. I requested another board meeting. Patricia denied the request. She didn't even bother with an explanation. Just had her assistant send me an email, saying the board wouldn't convene for non-urgent matters. When I tried to talk to her directly, she told me I was overstepping my position. "You're here to learn and support, not to redesign the company," she said. "Focus on your actual job." Derek, overhearing the conversation, added his own jab. "Maybe stick to your schoolwork, little sister. Leave the real business to people who know what they're doing." I went to my father that night. We sat in his study at home, surrounded by his beloved books, and I laid out everything. The improvements I'd made, the data supporting change, the urgent need to modernize before Warner and Sons became irrelevant. He listened patiently, nodding in the right places, his expression sympathetic. When I finished, he sighed deeply. "Natalie, your mother is doing what she thinks is best," he said. "I know you have ideas, and they're probably good ones. But she's under a lot of pressure to maintain profitability. Maybe give her some time." I felt my chest tighten with frustration. Dad, we're losing the company grandfather built, I said. Doesn't that matter to you? He looked away, uncomfortable with confrontation as always. Of course it matters, he said. But I'm not a businessman. Your mother has kept Warner and Sons running for years now. That counts for something. I realized then that I'd get no help from him. Robert Warner was a good man and a caring father, but he'd never stand up to Patricia. Not for me, not for grandfather Frank's legacy, not for anything. So I kept pushing on my own. I began reaching out to our old clients, the ones who'd been with Warner and Sons since grandfather Frank's time. Many had reduced their orders or stopped buying from us altogether. I asked them why, conducting informal interviews during my lunch breaks. The responses were painfully consistent. The quality isn't what it used to be. We've found suppliers who care more about the product. Warner and Sons feels like they're just churning out generic furniture now. One client, the CEO of a law firm that had furnished 3 offices with our products over 20 years, was particularly blunt. Your grandfather made furniture with soul, she said. What you're selling now is just wood shaped like furniture. There's a difference. I compiled these interviews into yet another report, this one focusing on brand erosion and client perception. I included suggestions for a premium product line that could command higher prices while returning to grandfather Frank's quality standards. We could run it parallel to Patricia's cost-optimized production, proving that the market still valued craftsmanship. I presented this plan to Patricia in her office, just the 2 of us, hoping a private conversation might be more productive than a board meeting. She didn't even read past the first page. Natalie, I'm going to be very clear with you, she said, setting the document aside. You are not in a position to make strategic decisions for this company. You're 21 years old with half a business degree and romantic notions about how things used to be. The market has changed. Grandfather Frank's way doesn't work anymore. We have to be lean and competitive. If you can't accept that, maybe you should reconsider whether you belong here. The threat was implicit but clear. Fall in line or get out. I left her office feeling like I'd been punched in the stomach. That evening, I drove out to the cemetery where grandfather Frank was buried. I sat by his headstone and told him everything, how Patricia was destroying his legacy, how nobody would listen, how powerless I felt. The sun set over the Oregon hills, and I made a decision. If I couldn't change Warner and Sons from the inside, I'd have to build something from the outside that would prove my vision was right. I threw myself into my studies with renewed intensity. I took every class I could on operations management, supply chain optimization, and business strategy. I sought out professors who had real-world industry experience and picked their brains during office hours. I read case studies of companies that had successfully modernized traditional manufacturing. I learned about digital tools that could streamline production planning and inventory management. Every piece of knowledge was a weapon I was forging for a battle I knew was coming. By my senior year, I was taking graduate-level courses and working on an independent study project that analyzed struggling furniture manufacturers across the Pacific Northwest. I identified patterns in why they failed, common mistakes in management approach, and opportunities for intervention. My faculty advisor, Professor James Kirkland, saw potential in the work. This could be the basis for a consulting practice, he told me. There are dozens of family-owned manufacturers facing the same problems you're documenting. Someone who understands both the craft and the business side could make a real difference. The idea took root. What if I could help other companies avoid the mistakes Patricia was making? What if I could prove that grandfather Frank's philosophy of quality and innovation could work in the modern market? I started reaching out to small manufacturers, offering free consulting in exchange for the chance to implement my ideas. A cabinet maker in Eugene was struggling with outdated equipment and inconsistent quality. I spent a weekend analyzing their operation and developed a phased modernization plan they could afford. They implemented it and saw a 20% reduction in defects within 2 months. A woodworking shop in Salem was losing contracts to cheaper competitors. I helped them identify a niche market for custom work that their larger competitors couldn't efficiently serve. They pivoted their marketing and pricing strategy, and within 6 months their revenue was up 35%. These small victories felt incredible. I was making a difference, proving that my ideas worked in the real world, not just in academic papers. But at Warner and Sons, things continued to deteriorate. Patricia doubled down on cost-cutting, laying off experienced workers and replacing them with cheaper labor. She fought the union at every turn, trying to reduce benefits and freeze wages. Derek got promoted to vice president of sales despite complaints from multiple clients about his aggressive tactics. My sister Olivia, who joined the company in an HR role, tried to stay neutral, but I could see the strain on her face. She knew things were wrong but didn't have the power or courage to speak up. I graduated with honors and immediately enrolled in a master's program in industrial management at Portland State University. The commute was longer, but Portland offered something Riverside couldn't: access to a thriving business community, networking opportunities with investors and consultants, and distance from Patricia's suffocating control. I got a tiny apartment in Southeast Portland and started building a life separate from Warner and Sons for the first time. My consulting work expanded. I took on clients across Oregon and Washington, helping small manufacturers optimize their operations. I developed a reputation for understanding both the technical and human sides of production. Workers trusted me because I'd been on factory floors my entire life. Owners trusted me because I delivered results. My client list grew, and I started charging real fees. By the time I was 24, I had enough steady work to support myself and was building a portfolio of success stories. That's when I met Leonard Hastings. He was a partner at a Portland-based industrial consulting firm called Summit Advisors, and he'd heard about my work through mutual contacts. He invited me to coffee at a downtown cafe, and we talked for 3 hours. Leonard was in his early 60s, a former manufacturing executive who'd turned to consulting after successfully turning around a struggling steel fabrication company. He asked probing questions about my approach, my philosophy, and my goals. I told him about Grandfather Frank, about Warner and Sons, about my vision for preserving craftsmanship while embracing modern efficiency. I explained my frustration with the false choice between quality and profitability, my belief that they could reinforce each other with the right approach. Leonard listened intently, occasionally jotting notes, his eyes sharp with interest. When I finished, he leaned back and smiled. "Natalie, I've been doing this for 20 years, and I can tell you that what you have can't be taught. You understand systems, but you also understand soul. That's rare." He offered me a position at Summit Advisors, a junior consultant role that would give me access to bigger clients and more complex projects. The salary was modest, but the learning opportunity was invaluable. I accepted immediately. Over the next 2 years, Leonard became more than a boss. He was a mentor in the truest sense, someone who saw my potential and actively worked to develop it. He taught me how to read financial statements with a critical eye, how to navigate difficult conversations with entrenched management, how to build coalitions among stakeholders with competing interests. We worked on projects across the Pacific Northwest. A furniture manufacturer in Spokane that was facing bankruptcy. A lumber mill in Northern California struggling with outdated equipment. A cabinetry company in Seattle losing market share to imported products. In each case, I applied the lessons I'd learned, both from Grandfather Frank and from my own research. We modernized operations, improved quality control, and helped these companies find profitable niches. The work was exhausting and exhilarating in equal measure. Leonard pushed me to think bigger. "You're great at fixing operational problems," he'd say, "but what about the financial structure? What about ownership transitions? What about acquisitions and mergers?" He introduced me to investment bankers and private equity professionals, people who dealt in buying and selling companies rather than just consulting for them. I attended industry conferences and workshops, absorbing everything I could about deal structuring, valuation methods, and post-acquisition integration. By the time I turned 26, an idea had crystallized. What if I didn't just consult for struggling manufacturers? What if I bought them, implemented my improvements, and either ran them long-term or sold them at a profit? Leonard loved the concept. "You'd be doing well by doing good," he said. "Saving companies, preserving jobs, and making money in the process. That's a business model with legs." He helped me develop a business plan, introduced me to potential investors, and guided me through the legal complexities of setting up an acquisition fund. In early 2017, I launched Apex Industrial Solutions. The name was deliberate, suggesting both peak performance and industrial focus. My model was straightforward. Identify small to mid-size manufacturers in distress, acquire them at fair prices, implement operational improvements, and either hold them as profitable ongoing concerns or sell them to strategic buyers. I started small, very small. My first acquisition was a failing hardware manufacturer in Bend that was 6 months from bankruptcy. I bought it for $800,000, mostly financed through a small business loan. I moved to Bend for 3 months, working alongside the employees to understand every aspect of the operation. The problems were familiar. Outdated equipment, poor inventory management, weak sales processes, and demoralized workers who'd watched quality slip for years. I brought in new CNC machines that could produce parts more precisely and efficiently. I reorganized the factory floor using lean principles. I worked with the sales team to identify more profitable customer segments. Most importantly, I listened to the workers, implemented their suggestions, and gave them reasons to take pride in their work again. Within a year, the company was profitable. Within 18 months, I sold it to a larger hardware conglomerate for $2.1 million. After paying off the acquisition loan and covering operational costs, I walked away with a profit of nearly $900,000. More importantly, I'd proven the model worked. I had a template I could replicate. Leonard was ecstatic. "You've created a flywheel," he told me. "Each success funds the next acquisition and builds your reputation. Keep this up and you'll have more opportunities than you can handle." He was right. Word spread in the small world of Pacific Northwest manufacturing. Apex Industrial Solutions became known as a company that could save struggling businesses without gutting them. I acquired a small commercial bakery equipment manufacturer, a custom metal workshop, and a specialty plastics company over the next 2 years. Each one followed the same pattern: assessment, acquisition, improvement, and either sale or retention. My team grew to include operations specialists, financial analysts, and industry experts. We developed systems and processes that made each acquisition smoother than the last. By 2020, Apex had a portfolio worth over $30 million. I'd become someone the industry took seriously. Business journals profiled me as a young turnaround specialist. Investment firms approached me about partnerships. I spoke at conferences about sustainable manufacturing and operational excellence. The success felt incredible, but it also felt incomplete. Because through all of it, I thought about Warner and Sons. About what it could be if someone with vision and capital took control. About grandfather Frank's legacy slowly dying under Patricia's mismanagement. I kept tabs on the company from a distance. Financial reports were public for the most part, and I still had friends who worked there who'd give me unofficial updates. The picture was grim. Revenue had declined every year since 2015. Major clients had departed. The workforce had been cut by nearly 40%. Quality complaints continued to rise. Patricia had taken on debt to cover operational shortfalls, leveraging the company's assets in ways that would have horrified grandfather Frank. Derek had left to start his own sales consultancy, taking several of Warner and Sons' remaining good clients with him. It was a slow-motion disaster. Then in May of 2023, I got a call from Tom Anderson. Tom was a commercial banker at First Valley Bank in Portland, and we'd worked together on several acquisition deals. He had a tip for me. "Natalie," he said, his voice low like he was sharing a secret. "Warner and Sons Manufacturing is going on the market. The board is authorizing a sale. They're in serious financial trouble and need to liquidate. I thought you might want to know, given your history." My heart stopped. This was it. The moment I'd been unconsciously preparing for since I left Riverside 8 years ago. I asked Tom for every detail he could share. The company was being valued at around $15 million, though the board would likely accept less for a quick sale. They were working with a business broker out of Portland to find buyers. The timeline was tight. They wanted to close before the end of the year for tax reasons. Patricia was leading the sale process, with the remaining board members, including my father, essentially rubber stamping her decisions. I thanked Tom and hung up, my mind already racing through possibilities. Apex had the capital and the credit to handle an acquisition of this size. I had the expertise to turn Warner and Sons around. But this wasn't just another deal. This was personal in ways that complicated everything. Could I stay objective? Could I separate my anger at Patricia from the business decision? More importantly, should I? I called Leonard and laid out the situation. He listened carefully, asking clarifying questions about the company's current state and the potential for turnaround. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Natalie, this is a good business opportunity based on what you're telling me," he finally said. "Apex could definitely make this work financially. But you need to be honest with yourself about your motivations. Are you buying this company to save your grandfather's legacy, or are you buying it to prove something to your mother? Because those are very different things, and they'll lead to very different outcomes." I thought about that question for days. Was this about vindication, or about genuine belief in Warner and Sons' potential? The truth was probably both, and I had to be okay with that complexity. Yes, I wanted to prove Patricia wrong. Yes, I wanted to show her that the vision she'd mocked and dismissed was not only viable but superior. But I also genuinely believed I could restore Warner and Sons to profitability and quality. I could honor what Grandfather Frank had built while modernizing it for current markets. The personal and professional motivations didn't have to be in conflict. I decided to move forward, but carefully. I couldn't approach the sale directly. If Patricia knew I was the potential buyer, she'd either reject my offer outright or inflate the price out of spite. I needed to maintain complete anonymity until the deal was closed. I set up a shell company, a subsidiary of Apex called Pacific Northwest Holdings, to handle the acquisition. Tom Anderson agreed to be my intermediary, communicating with the business broker without revealing the ultimate buyer's identity. We structured the offer to be attractive, $14.2 million with a quick close and minimal contingencies. The due diligence process was emotionally brutal. I pored over financial statements that documented Patricia's mismanagement in painful detail. I reviewed customer contracts that showed the erosion of relationships Grandfather Frank had spent decades building. I analyzed equipment inventories that revealed just how outdated the factory had become. Every page was evidence of what could have been prevented, what should have been prevented if anyone had listened to me years ago. But I also saw the potential. The Warner and Sons brand still had value, particularly among older clients who remembered the quality. The factory building and equipment, while outdated, were solid assets that could be upgraded. The workforce, though diminished, included several longtime employees who still cared about the work. The product line could be refreshed and repositioned. With proper investment and management, Warner and Sons could be profitable again within 2 years. I submitted my offer through Pacific Northwest Holdings in early September. Tom told me there were 2 other interested parties, but my offer was the strongest. The board voted to accept it in late October, with closing scheduled for November 22nd, 2 days before Thanksgiving. Patricia had no idea she was selling to me. None of them did. As far as they knew, they were getting out from under a failing business and walking away with enough money to fund whatever came next for them. The closing happened in a conference room at First Valley Bank. I didn't attend in person, working through Tom and my attorney to sign the documents remotely. When the final papers were executed and the money transferred, I owned Warner and Sons Manufacturing. Grandfather Frank's company was mine. I sat in my Portland office that afternoon, holding a copy of the ownership documents, and cried. Not from sadness, but from the weight of what I'd just done and what it meant. I had 10 days before Thanksgiving, before I'd see my family for the first time in over a year. Patricia had called a few weeks earlier, insisting that everyone come to Riverside for the holiday. "It's important we're all together," she'd said, her tone leaving no room for argument. I'd agreed, knowing exactly what she was planning. She was going to announce the sale, probably frame it as a difficult but necessary decision, and almost certainly use it as another opportunity to remind everyone that I'd contributed nothing to the family's success. I spent those 10 days preparing. Not just emotionally, though that was part of it. I prepared my strategy for what would come after the revelation. I worked with my team at Apex to develop a 100-day plan for Warner and Sons. We'd start with a full operational assessment, then move to equipment upgrades, workforce training, and market repositioning. I reached out quietly to some of the clients who'd left, testing whether they'd be willing to give Warner and Sons another chance under new management. The responses were cautiously optimistic. I also prepared for the personal fallout. There was no scenario where this ended with reconciliation and family harmony. Patricia would be furious. Derek would be vindictive. My father would be confused and uncomfortable. Olivia and Kevin would be caught in the middle. But I'd made peace with that. Some bridges were meant to burn, especially when they led nowhere good. The drive to Riverside on Thanksgiving morning felt surreal. The landscape was familiar, the same highways and hills I'd traveled countless times growing up. But I was returning as someone completely different from the girl who'd left. I was successful, proven, powerful in ways they couldn't imagine. And I was about to upend everything they thought they knew about me and about themselves. I arrived at the Warner family estate around noon. The house looked the same, a sprawling craftsman-style home that grandfather Frank had built in the 1980s when Warner and Sons first became truly profitable. Cars lined the circular driveway. Aunt Rachel and Uncle Gerald had driven up from California. Olivia's car was there, along with Kevin's truck. I parked and sat for a moment, steeling myself. Then I grabbed the small bag I'd brought and walked to the front door. Olivia answered, her face lighting up briefly before settling into something more guarded. "Hey Nat," she said, using my childhood nickname. "It's been a while." We hugged awkwardly, and I could feel the tension in her body. She knew something was coming, even if she didn't know what. Inside, the house smelled like roasting meat and pie. Uncle Gerald was in the living room watching football. Aunt Rachel was in the kitchen with my mother, the two of them working in synchronized silence. Kevin emerged from upstairs and gave me a bro hug that felt performative. My father was the last to appear, coming in from his study with a book still in his hand. He looked older than I remembered, more gray in his hair, more lines around his eyes. "Natalie," he said warmly, and hugged me properly. "I've missed you." I hugged him back, feeling a pang of sadness. He was a good man who'd spent his life avoiding conflict, and that avoidance had enabled so much damage. I loved him, but I also couldn't respect the choices he'd made. Patricia emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel. Her eyes swept over me, cold and assessing. "You made it," she said flatly. "I wasn't sure you would." I smiled. "Wouldn't miss it, Mom," I said. "Thanksgiving is about family, right?" She made a non-committal sound and returned to the kitchen. The afternoon crawled by with forced small talk and uncomfortable silences. I helped set the table, answered questions about my life in Portland with careful vagueness, and watched my family pretend everything was normal. Then came dinner. We gathered around the long dining table, the same one where we'd shared meals when grandfather Frank was alive. Patricia had gone all out with the food, probably wanting to make a statement. She and Aunt Rachel brought out the plates, and that's when it happened. Everyone else got beautiful servings of prime rib, perfectly cooked and garnished. Roasted vegetables, creamy mashed potatoes, fresh rolls. Their plates were works of art. Mine was an insult. A chipped ceramic plate with dried-out pot roast from days ago, sitting next to plain white rice. No vegetables. No garnish. No care. The contrast was so stark it took my breath away. The table went silent as Patricia set it in front of me with deliberate ceremony. "This is what you've earned, Natalie," she said, her voice cold with satisfaction. "We serve based on contribution to this family, and well, this reflects yours accurately." The silence around that table felt like physical pressure against my skull. I looked down at the dried pot roast, the grains of plain rice clumped together and cold, then slowly raised my eyes to meet my mother's gaze. She stood behind my chair with her hand resting on the back like she'd just delivered a masterpiece. Her face held an expression of smug righteousness that I'd seen countless times before. That look that said she'd finally put me in my proper place. Derek raised his wine glass from across the table, his voice dripping with mock sincerity. "Here's to getting what we deserve," he said. Kevin clinked his glass against Derek's, both of them trying to suppress grins. I picked up my fork with steady hands and cut a piece of that awful meat. The texture was like shoe leather, tough and stringy and completely devoid of moisture. I chewed it slowly, maintaining eye contact with Patricia the entire time. She wanted a reaction. She wanted tears or anger or humiliation. I gave her nothing but a calm smile. Then I set my fork down carefully, dabbed my mouth with the napkin, and leaned back in my chair. The casual confidence in my posture seemed to unsettle her. Her smile flickered just slightly. "Mom," I said, my voice cutting through the uncomfortable quiet. "I have a question about Warner and Sons." Her spine stiffened immediately. Derek stopped mid-sip, his glass hovering near his lips. My father looked up from his plate with confusion spreading across his features. "What about Warner and Sons?" Patricia said sharply, her tone defensive. "That's no longer any concern of yours. You made that clear years ago when you walked away." I nodded slowly, as if considering her words. "That's interesting," I said, keeping my tone conversational. "Because I heard through some business contacts that the company is being sold. Something about a deal with a firm out of Portland for around $15 million. How's that process going?" "I'm curious about the buyer." The color started draining from Patricia's face. Her hand tightened on the back of my chair, until her knuckles went white. "How do you know about that?" she demanded, her voice rising an octave. "That information is confidential." I allowed myself a small smile. "Oh, you'd be surprised what I know, Mom," I said. "I've spent the last 8 years building a pretty extensive network in the Pacific Northwest manufacturing sector. People talk. Deals get discussed. Tom Anderson over at First Valley Bank is actually a good friend of mine. We've worked together on quite a few acquisitions over the years. Lovely guy. Very professional. Very thorough with all the paperwork and documentation." Patricia's face had gone from pale to an alarming shade of red. She came around the table toward me, her movements sharp and aggressive. "What acquisitions?" she hissed. "What are you talking about?" I stood up, smoothing my napkin and placing it beside that insulting plate of scraps. "Well," I said, meeting her furious gaze without flinching, "the acquisitions I've handled through my company, Apex Industrial Solutions. We specialize in buying struggling manufacturing businesses and turning them around. Surely you've heard of us. We've been making quite a name for ourselves. We're based in Portland, but our reach extends across Oregon, Washington, and into Northern California." Derek shot to his feet so fast his chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. "What game are you playing, Natalie?" he snarled, his face flushed with anger and wine. "This is ridiculous. You're making this up to get attention like you always do." I turned to face him directly, my expression calm. "I'm not playing any games, Derek," I said. "I'm simply curious about who's purchasing Warner and Sons Manufacturing. You know, the company that grandfather Frank built from nothing. The one he poured his heart and soul into for over 30 years. The one Mom has been systematically running into the ground since he died." Patricia slammed her hand down on the table hard enough to make the glasses jump and wine slosh dangerously close to the rims. "How dare you?" she shouted, her voice shaking with rage. "You have no right to speak about that company. You abandoned it. You walked away when things got difficult because you couldn't handle real business decisions. You were always too idealistic, too stubborn, too convinced you knew better than everyone else. Well, look where that got you. Nowhere." I let her words hang in the air for a moment, watching her chest heave with anger. Then I pulled my phone from my pocket and opened my email application. I turned the screen toward everyone at the table, slowly rotating so they could all see. "This is the purchase agreement for Warner and Sons Manufacturing," I said, my voice steady and clear. "Signed and executed on November 22nd, 2 days ago. The buyer is Pacific Northwest Holdings, which is a subsidiary of Apex Industrial Solutions. My company. I am the sole owner and CEO. That means, Mom, that when you sold Warner and Sons, you sold it to me." The reaction was instantaneous and explosive. Kevin knocked over his wine glass completely, red liquid spreading across the white tablecloth like blood pooling from a wound. Aunt Rachel gasped so loudly it sounded like a small scream. Uncle Gerald just stared with his mouth hanging open. Olivia's fork clattered to her plate, her hand flying to cover her mouth. My father stood up so abruptly that his chair tipped backward and crashed to the floor with a bang that made everyone jump. The sound echoed through the dining room like a gunshot. Derek's face went through a rapid color change from red to purple to an almost gray shade. "You're lying," he said, but his voice had lost its conviction. His hands were shaking. "This is insane. This is some kind of sick joke. Show me that document. Let me see it." I walked around the table and handed him my phone. He grabbed it roughly, his eyes scanning the screen frantically. I watched his face as the reality sank in. The legal language was clear and unmistakable. Sale of 100% ownership of Warner & Sons Manufacturing from the existing board of directors to Pacific Northwest Holdings LLC for the sum of $14.2 million. Closing date November 22. My signature on the buyer line. Patricia had gone completely still, frozen like a statue. Her mouth opened and closed but no sound came out. She looked like she was trying to process information that simply wouldn't compute. Finally, she found her voice, though it came out thin and strained. "This can't be legal," she said. "You deceived us. You went behind our backs. You used false pretenses. We can sue. We can reverse this." I shook my head calmly. "Everything was completely legal and above board, Mom," I said. "Pacific Northwest Holdings is a registered business entity. All disclosures were made according to Oregon law. You had every opportunity to conduct due diligence on the buyer. The fact that you didn't bother to look past the name of the holding company isn't my problem." My father finally found his voice, though it sounded weak and confused. "Natalie, why didn't you tell us?" he asked, spreading his hands in a helpless gesture. "We're your family. We could have discussed this. We could have worked something out together." I turned to face him, and I felt a surge of anger break through my calm facade. "Discussed it, Dad?" I said, my voice harder than I intended. "Like we discussed my ideas when I was 18 and 19 and 20? Like we discussed the customer complaints and the quality issues and the loss of market share? Oh wait, we didn't discuss any of that. Mom shut me down every single time, and you sat there silent. You always sit there silent." He flinched like I'd slapped him, and part of me felt guilty. But the larger part, the part that had been dismissed and humiliated and pushed out, felt nothing but righteous anger. "You want to know why I didn't tell you?" I continued, looking around the table at all of them. "Because I didn't trust any of you to do the right thing. I didn't trust Mom to put Grandfather Frank's legacy ahead of her own ego. I didn't trust Derek not to sabotage the deal out of spite. And I didn't trust you, Dad, to stand up for what was right instead of just avoiding conflict like you always do." Olivia spoke up for the first time, her voice small and uncertain. "Nat, this is a lot to process," she said. "I mean, I understand you're angry about how things went down years ago. But buying the company in secret? That feels like you're punishing all of us." I looked at my younger sister and felt a pang of sympathy. She'd always been caught in the middle, trying to keep the peace, never quite brave enough to choose a side. "Olivia, I'm not punishing anyone," I said more gently. "I'm saving a company that was about to die. Warner & Sons has been losing money for years. The debt load is crushing. Major clients have fled. If I hadn't bought it, it would have been liquidated within 18 months. Everything Grandfather Frank built would have been gone forever." Patricia found her fury again, her voice rising to a near shriek. "You don't get to do this," she shouted, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You don't get to swoop in and play savior after abandoning us. That company survived because of my decisions, my management, my sacrifices. You were a child with unrealistic fantasies about how business works. I kept Warner & Sons running for 18 years. I met her rage with cold facts. You ran it into the ground, Mom," I said flatly. "Revenue is down 40% from when Grandfather Frank died. You've lost 70% of your major accounts. Worker turnover is through the roof. Quality complaints have tripled. You took on $8 million in debt just to cover operating expenses. The only reason the company had any value left to sell was the brand name and the real estate. Everything else, all the relationships and reputation and craftsmanship that Grandfather Frank built, you destroyed that." She started to respond, but I cut her off, my voice rising for the first time. "And you know what the worst part is?" I said, stepping closer to her. "I tried to help. For years, I tried. I showed you data. I presented plans. I demonstrated that my ideas worked. But you couldn't stand the thought that I might be right and you might be wrong. You couldn't handle the idea that your daughter understood the business better than you did. So you pushed me out, belittled me, and then tried to erase me from the family legacy entirely." Derek jumped back in, his voice nasty. "This is about revenge," he spat. You're just a vindictive brat who can't let go of old grudges. You bought the company to hurt Mom, to make her feel small. That's pathetic, Natalie. Really pathetic. I turned to face him fully, and when I spoke, my voice was ice. You want to talk about pathetic, Derek? I said. Let's talk about how you rode Mom's favoritism to a VP position you weren't qualified for. Let's talk about how you pushed aggressive sales tactics that drove away loyal clients. Let's talk about how you left Warner and Sons to start your own consultancy and immediately poached 3 of our biggest remaining accounts. You extracted every bit of value you could, and then jumped ship. So don't you dare lecture me about motives. He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. He knew I was right. Everyone at that table knew I was right. Kevin, who'd been silent through most of the confrontation, finally spoke up. So what happens now? He asked quietly. You own the company. What are you going to do with it? I took a deep breath, trying to regain my composure. I'm going to do what should have been done years ago, I said. I'm going to modernize the equipment, improve the quality standards, rebuild relationships with clients, and restore Warner and Sons to what it was meant to be. I'm going to honor Grandfather Frank's vision while bringing the company into the 21st century. Patricia laughed, but it was a harsh, brittle sound with no humor in it. You think you can just fix everything, she said. You think you can walk in with your MBA and your Portland connections and magically turn things around? You're delusional. That company is beyond saving. I sold it because it was a sinking ship. You just bought yourself a very expensive anchor. I smiled, and this time it was genuine. Mom, I've turned around 6 manufacturing companies in the last 8 years, I said. Companies that were in worse shape than Warner and Sons. I've developed systems and processes and a team of experts who know exactly how to assess problems and implement solutions. This is what I do. This is what I'm good at. And unlike you, I actually care about more than just quarterly profits. My father tried one more time to mediate, his voice pleading. This doesn't have to tear the family apart, he said. Natalie, you've accomplished something remarkable. You've built a successful company and now you have a chance to restore your grandfather's legacy. Can't we find a way to move forward together? Support each other? I looked at him sadly. Dad, this family tore apart years ago, I said. When Mom pushed me out. When Derek undermined me at every turn. When everyone stood by and watched it happen without saying a word. I'm not the one who created this divide. I'm just the one who refused to pretend it doesn't exist. Patricia grabbed her wine glass and drained it in one long swallow. Then she set it down with a sharp click. Fine, she said, her voice cold and controlled again. You want the company? You have it. I hope it destroys you the way you've tried to destroy me tonight. I hope you fail spectacularly and lose everything. And when you do, don't come crawling back here looking for sympathy or help. As far as I'm concerned, you're no longer my daughter. The words should have hurt. Part of me expected them to cut deep, to make me question everything I'd done. Instead, I felt nothing but relief. The pretense was finally over. The toxic relationship was finally acknowledged. I looked at Patricia, really looked at her, and saw someone small and bitter and afraid. Afraid that she'd wasted years, afraid that she'd failed, afraid that her daughter had surpassed her in every meaningful way. Okay, Mom, I said quietly. If that's how you feel, I can accept that. I picked up my bag from where I'd set it by the door. I'm going to head back to Portland tonight, I said to the room at large. There's a lot of work to do. Olivia, if you want to stay involved with the company, we can talk. My door is open. Kevin, same for you. Dad, I'll always be your daughter even if Mom doesn't want me as hers. But I'm done trying to force relationships that clearly aren't meant to be. I walked toward the door and Olivia called after me. Nat, wait. She hurried over, her eyes red and shining with unshed tears. I don't know what to say, she whispered. This is all so much. I hugged her briefly. You don't have to say anything right now, I told her. Just think about what you want. The company is going to change, and there will be opportunities if you want them. She nodded, wiping her eyes. The drive back to Portland felt surreal. The confrontation replayed in my mind. Every word and gesture and expression. I thought about Grandfather Frank, about what he would have said if he could have seen that dinner. Part of me thought he'd be proud that I'd stood up for myself and for his legacy. Part of me thought he'd be sad about the family fracturing so completely. But mostly, I think he'd understand. He'd always valued truth over comfort, principle over peace. When I got back to my apartment, I called Leonard Hastings. Despite the late hour, he answered on the second ring. "How did it go?" he asked. I gave him the full rundown, from the humiliating plate of scraps to Patricia's final disowning. When I finished, there was a long pause. Then Leonard spoke, his voice thoughtful. "Natalie, what you did tonight took courage," he said. "Walking into that situation knowing what would happen, holding your ground, refusing to be diminished. That's not easy, even when you're in the right. How are you feeling?" I thought about the question. "Honestly," I said, "I feel free. For the first time in years, I don't have to wonder what they think of me or hope they'll finally see my worth. It's done. The bridge is burned. And now I can focus entirely on the work." Leonard chuckled. "That's my girl," he said. "Now let's talk about your 100-day plan for Warner and Sons. We've got a company to save." Over the next 6 months, I threw myself into transforming Warner and Sons with an intensity that bordered on obsession. I moved my primary office to Riverside, commuting from Portland on weekends. The first day I walked into the factory as the owner was emotional. Some of the longtime workers recognized me, and their faces showed a mixture of surprise, hope, and skepticism. I called an all-hands meeting and laid out my vision. "We're going back to what made this company great," I told them. "Quality, craftsmanship, innovation. But we're also moving forward with new technology and processes. I need your expertise and your commitment. Together, we can make Warner and Sons something Grandfather Frank would be proud of." The transformation was methodical. We invested $2 million in new CNC equipment and modern finishing systems. We brought in industrial engineers to optimize the factory floor layout. We hired a quality control manager who implemented rigorous inspection protocols. We rebuilt relationships with premium material suppliers, even though it costs more because the quality difference was worth it. We launched a comprehensive website with custom design tools that let clients visualize their furniture before ordering. We rebranded with marketing that emphasized our heritage while highlighting our modern capabilities. The results came faster than I dared hope. Within 3 months, we'd won back 2 major accounts that had left years ago. Within 6 months, revenue was up 28%. By the end of the first year, Warner and Sons was profitable for the first time in 5 years. Industry publications wrote about the turnaround. Business schools asked me to speak about the case study. Job applications poured in from craftsmen who wanted to work for a company that valued their skills. Patricia never reached out, and I never contacted her. I heard through Olivia that Mom had moved to Arizona, taking her share of the sale money and starting over in a place where people didn't know about her failures. Derek's consultancy struggled and eventually folded. Kevin ended up moving to Seattle for a tech job. My father and I rebuilt our relationship slowly, meeting for coffee every few weeks. He never apologized for his passivity, but he expressed pride in what I'd accomplished. Olivia did join Warner and Sons, taking a role in human resources where she could help rebuild the company culture. Working together, we became closer than we'd ever been. She told me once that watching me stand up to Patricia that Thanksgiving had given her courage to make her own changes. "Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for family is refuse to enable their dysfunction," she said. I think about that dinner often. About the plate of scraps that was meant to humiliate me, but instead became the catalyst for claiming everything I'd worked for. About Patricia's face when she realized she'd sold to her own daughter. About the moment I chose my own path over their approval. Standing in the Warner and Sons factory today, watching skilled craftsmen create furniture that will last generations, I know I made the right choice. Grandfather Frank's voice still echoes in my mind when I walk these floors. Make things better always. And that's exactly what I've done. Not just for the company, but for myself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.